Hi, my name's Londe Yusuf.
And my name is Reggie Williams.
And we're the co-founders of Black Film Space. Black Film Space is a grassroots organization dedicated to enhancing the skill sets of Black filmmakers and building a community of creatives. We host events such as screenwriting workshops, panels, mixers, and other events that are designed to support Black content creators.
In the latest episode of the Black Film Space podcast, we interview Anedra Edwards. Anedra was an assistant editor on the HBO show Crashing and is currently a visual effects assistant editor on the CW's Black Lightning. We talked to Anedra about what a day in the life is like in the editorial room, whether or not editors need agents, the difference between editing a superhero show and a comedy, and much more. Hey Anedra, how are you? How you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you very much for joining us on the Black Film Space podcast. We're looking forward to your insight.
No worries. I'm excited to be here and just glad I have have knowledge that I can share.
Thank you. So to start off, you are an assistant editor for Black Lightning.
Yeah, specifically in visual effects.
Specifically in visual effects.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get to Black Lightning? How did you get started in your career?
Wow, that's a loaded question. It's been quite a journey. I guess, if we want to start, from beginning, I actually, when I graduated college, which was in 2010, I'd already been kind of introduced to working with editorial and media while I was in college and kind of production. And I used to be a production assistant when I was in college. And so I also interned at BT. That was one of my first industry jobs or introduction to the industry. My summer of my junior year going into college. Summer going into my senior year is when I interned with BT, and I started off as a production assistant. I did my first event. My first show was Bobby Jones' Gospel Show, and the post coordinator production coordinator and production manager. They really were great to work with, and they enjoyed having me. And so I got invited back for several more live shows or award shows, you could say. So that's when I started being a production assistant for Bobby Jones' Gospel Show, 2 seasons of that. I did Rip the Runway with BET, also BET Award Show, and I think there's another one, but I can't remember it at the moment. Mm-hmm. And so that was my first introduction to it. And then after I graduated college, I came back and worked with BET. For a summer. I was an on-air promotions coordinator, which was a fancy title for someone who schedules the commercials. Mm-hmm. And so I did that filling in for a summer. And then I actually got an internship right after that. I guess you could say it was an externship because I had technically graduated college already. But a lot of companies are not trying to do that anymore. You have to be in school to have the internship credit. But I came out during the recession. So I did an internship 2010 with NBC at NBC headquarters, Rockefeller Plaza in New York. And I worked in affiliate marketing. So we were responsible for sending different network content to the various NBC affiliate stations, spread across the U.S. Mm-hmm. And so we had owned and operated stations, as well as some stations that are owned by various other companies. We would send them our content. That would be for advertising or for marketing, usually for Dateline, NBC News programming, which would include the Today Show, etc. And so interned there for a season, and then was able to parlay that into becoming associate producer and editor for my local NBC station in my hometown, which is Washington, D.C.
Okay.
And so I went from New York back to D.C. and started working there. Worked there about a little less than 2 years. And around, my experience there, it taught me a lot. I worked specifically in news advertising. And I found out through that process, I enjoyed news, but, it wasn't necessarily where I felt I was meant to be. I had to write, basically I wrote and edited 15 to 30-second promos that were regarding 5 o'clock and 11 o'clock news stories. And so most of the 5 o'clock news stories were consumer stories, and then 11 o'clock, news was more of the more serious stories, more of adult, based type stories. And so that was great, a great experience. I learned that writing for news advertising wasn't like my forte, wasn't necessarily where I wanted to be, but I loved editing. And so I really used that opportunity to find myself in editorial. Like, okay, I can be in a creative space and edit. And I knew like from then on, I wanted to be an editor. And so I left NBC and actually went to grad school. I went to American University, which I know some of my colleagues from there. And I did American University's MFA program. So that brings us to 2012 when I started the program there. And I really enjoyed my experience doing the MFA program at American. I focused, most of my projects were in editorial, but I got a very well-rounded experience while I was at American. And I also studied abroad while I was there. I went to film school in the Czech Republic for one of their performing arts academies there, and really enjoyed the opportunity. And from while I was in grad school, I worked as an assistant editor for National Geographic Channel. That was one of my primary gigs while I was there. And then once I finished my master's, that was 2015. I went back I stayed in Nat Geo for a little bit of time, and then I ended up transitioning over to Discovery Channel, which is at the time their headquarters was in Silver Spring, Maryland. Now they're transitioning out. I think they closed that location. But I hopped over there, and I worked on a show called The Puppy Bowl, which is on Animal Planet. And so I was an assistant editor in reality TV, basically. So I worked on that show, and I knew kind of like through talking with my colleagues that I wanted to move to Los Angeles. Yeah. I had some classmates who had already kind of done the jump from the East Coast to West Coast. And that was kind of a goal. Like I wanted to have that experience. And so I started working. I was assistant editor with Discovery, but I also would freelance for smaller independent companies that did programming for Discovery as well. So I worked on several Shark Week shows while I was starting that year. I guess to say those 2 years right after, I won't say 2 years. I think it was just a year right after I graduated from grad school. So I was working like everywhere. I felt like I was working like 50 jobs. I was assistant editor for, I had Puppy Bowl, and I hopped to Shark Week shows. I was also an editor for AARP, had like their own kind of editorial team. Mm-hmm. So I was doing more corporate style editing as well. And then I ended up moving from working on the show, that was on Discovery for Puppy Bowl, also to being an international editor in their operations department. So we were responsible for reformatting shows for international broadcasts that had already broadcasted in the US. So that brings us up to 2016. I was doing all of that. And then 2016, I made the move to the West Coast, made the jump over here. And since I had already kind of experience in reality TV or docuseries, I guess you could say, I knew that I could get work in LA off of the freelance knowledge that I had from the East Coast. I kind of had some, websites I go to specifically for editorial jobs and some little, connects that I had. So I knew I could get work. So I moved out here and I actually started working with a production company called World of Wonder Productions as an assistant editor there. And they primarily produced Bravo Network shows. They also, their big show is RuPaul's Drag Race. Mm-hmm. And so that's their Emmy Award winning show. And so that was pretty cool of an experience. I worked on a show with them called Real Estate Wars. That was my primary show. And then I also hopped to $1 Million Listing, Los Angeles. So those were like my two primary shows. And so I worked with them for about probably a little less than 8 months. And I hopped to Discovery again. A Discovery show. It was actually produced by another independent company. But I hopped to a show, Naked and Afraid, as an assistant editor. And actually by the time I had moved to LA, I had already finished the credentials to join my union, which is the Motion Picture Editors Guild. So I was actually like networking to try to get my first union show. And so Naked and Afraid with Discovery Channel, which is a extreme survival competition, which deals with people who are, survivalists in their own world, outside of the show. They actually come and they try to last 28 days with limited resources, naked. And so, say again? I
said that doesn't sound desirable.
Well, for them, it's, that's kind of a world that, they exist in. And it I don't know, it's one of Discovery's like biggest shows. Like it's one of their biggest hits. And so it's interesting when I was assistant editor on that show, a lot of people would ask me, do you get the footage blurred? Like, before you see it? And I'm like, no, like I get raw footage. So I see everybody's everything. And so that was a really interesting experience. So I was actually there for a really short time, probably like less than a month, before I got my first scripted show, which was HBO's comedy Crashing. I worked on season 2.
That's dope.
Yeah, so it was, I had been like, when I moved here, I was really hustling, networking as much as I could, talking to other assistant editors who had already done scripted TV. And, even before then, I had like each phase was, how can I consistently work in LA? And it was like, okay, I've got a consistent work. How can I, get out of reality TV into scripted? And so like, learning that step. So I met a lot of great individuals along the way. And so I hopped to HBO. And again, I was there for not a super long time. I actually was filling in for an assistant editor that got sick. And HBO ended up liking me and wanted me to stay. And I was really excited. But because I knew that my contract may not be that long, because this assistant editor may come back, I actually had networked to start at Black Lightning at CW. So I worked on Crashing for about two and a half months in its editorial schedule. And I ended up hopping over to Black Lightning on its first season. So I started that show from scratch, and I initially interviewed as a picture assistant editor. And
what is that?
So a picture assistant editor for picture means you're dealing specifically, with the layout of the show. Like you're working with an editor that is editing the picture. And I guess you would say just like how you would think most editors, that's usually a picture editor. And I guess how would I phrase it? I started, interviewing for if an editor came onto the show and didn't have an assistant editor with them, which usually a lot of editors would bring an assistant editor with them. That's kind of a usual flow. But in case there was an editor who did not have an assistant editor, my producers interviewed me so that I could, be available. And so I got a call from my producers one day, and they said, "Hey, all of our editors, it looks like they're going to be bringing in their assistant editors, but we have an opportunity in visual effects. Are you interested?" And I said, of course. I was open, and they had saw that I had visual effects experience on my resume, that I at least knew how to dive into After Effects and dive into a few other programs and kind of work my way around. So I came on as a visual effects assistant editor, and I've been with them since season 1, and I'm about to go into season 3.
Nice.
So that's hopefully that wasn't too long.
That's okay. It's okay.
Breath of it.
That's dope. What are the requirements to get into the union?
So the requirements for the Motion Picture Editors Guild, it varies depending on the position that you're coming in. So you can come in as an assistant editor, you can come in as an editor, a sound editor. So there's lots of different varying levels. So for assistant editor, you have to have 100 days worked on a production, that gets approved by the Editors Guild. So usually if you are, I guess it's getting very interesting period of time. Usually if you're working on something that's aired on TV, that's pretty pretty solid. Like they can background check that, and you're usually pretty good to go. With new media, it gets really interesting. Like web series and things like that. It's in there's like different qualifications for that. And then also, if you worked on the feature side, of course, you can usually use that. But it kind of depends, on what the level of the product and the project. So it's usually 100 days, worked on an approved project from the union. And then, let's see. Yeah, it's usually that. And then you have to pay your fees. Okay. And then also you take, we do a number of like training courses. Once you come in, once they've like cleared all of your material and everything like that, you have to take these safety courses, which for editorial, sometimes it doesn't always feel like it's applicable, because it's telling you like how it's let's see how to phrase it. It is monitored by OSHA. And so a lot of the different courses deal with like if you're on a production set, like what are your rights? Like what are you supposed to know? What are you supposed to do? Kind of thing. And editorial, a lot of times we're not on set. We're in a room, in a dark room that's usually away from production, and stuff. But you still have to do these training courses and everything. So those are that's one of the requirements. And then usually you're all cleared by the time you finish that. And then you just need your first union show. And then you can start receiving union benefits.
Okay, cool. What are some of the benefits?
So the benefits are really great, actually. And besides the obvious that happens with unions, you get a base pay, for depending on the productions. So they have different tiers of productions. I like Black Lighting is considered a major studio or studio major production. And so it's under Warner Brothers. And so I have a field representative who works with the union and with Warner Brothers to help make sure that I have everything that I need, or if I have questions, they can be that liaison for me. So that's really great. Coming from a freelance world, before I moved to LA, a lot of things I would have to scope out on my own, or I was doing a lot by myself. So it's great to kind of have that support. I have my pension and my healthcare through my union. So that's really great. We actually almost went on strike earlier last year because we were renegotiating our deals through, we're part of IATSE, or IATSE, which there are a lot of guilds and unions that fall under them in the TV film world. So you have like makeup artists, that fall under IATSE. You have who else? We call them Teamsters. They're under there. Gaffers, a whole gamut. So that's kind of the umbrella of several unions is IATSE.
What is IATSE exactly?
So IATSE is, let me give you, I don't want to say it wrong. Let me give you
they're not a union. You said unions fall under them.
So they're a labor union.
Okay.
Like in terms of how many, like they represent various artisans, craftspersons, technicians in the industry. Yeah. And then we're kind of split into our groups under IATSE. So let me see. I want to make sure I get the correct International Association of Theatrical Stage Employees.
Got it. Thank you so much.
So, yeah, so that's the one, because I didn't want to say it wrong. And so we fall under them into what we call locals. And so I'm local 700, which is the Editors Guild. And so you have several other locals. It is local 300, maybe a local 200. I hope that exists. But they're separated under these local numbers. And then you have the name, like mine is Motion Pictures Editors Guild and stuff. So we fall under the umbrella of IATSE. And so they make they do the labor negotiations for us that will end up affecting, each local. and stuff. So it was really interesting. We had a big vote that came about last year that was going to be dealing with changes or contributions from various studios that would affect our pension. And it dealt specifically with like streaming, and then also our turnaround hours. How would I explain that? So our turnaround hours in terms of if I finish like 10 o'clock, I'm supposed to have a 9-hour turnaround. So meaning like I have 9 hours before I come back to work.
Yeah.
So, we had to negotiate that. It used to be 8. We pitched for 10. I think we got 9, out of our new contract.
Okay.
And so it's really, I find that being in a union has been more beneficial than me operating as a contractor by myself. It just works so well in an industry that there's so many moving parts and moving arms that you kind of need that protection because it's really easy to get taken advantage of.
Okay. So you also mentioned that you did a lot of networking to come up and as an assistant editor and to get on some of these bigger shows and narrative shows. Do you have an agent?
I do not at the moment. I know a lot of assistant editors who don't have agents at this stage. But when you do go to once you go up to being an editor under the union, there is an option. And I know a lot of editors who do have agents. It kind of helps to have someone go in there and do the conversations for you that may be tough, or to preserve a relationship. You may use your agent to do your negotiations for you for your contracts. Like I said, the union will have a base pay. We'll have a base rate, but you can always negotiate up from there.
Yeah.
So a lot of editors could, depending on the experience they're coming in with, or what have you, they can always negotiate. Outside of that, and so like a couple of my editors on Black Lightning, they have agents. I guess a good amount of my colleagues who are editors who have them, and they can also help you find the work that you need as well. You have some projects that they specifically may want, a woman in the editing and the cutting room, or they may want a person of color, or they may want a person with this experience, and your agent can be kind of, those eyes for projects that are coming up that are looking for, I don't know, they want somebody, an editor who's been an athlete before, because it's a sports related, topic. So it kind of helps to have that as well, those extra eyes.
Mm-hmm. How does having, using your example, how does having an athlete, how is that beneficial for the show or for the project? Because they're editing something that is related to athletes or athletics. Like, what's the benefit of that?
Well, when you're in the cutting room, you're the last rewrite. You're the last stage of the story, becoming what it is. And when you sit at your computer, when you're sitting at your editing system, all of your experiences affect how you may interpret a story. And that is, beneficial. Sometimes it can, work in many different ways. But usually, it's beneficial to have the experiences that you come with to be able to articulate a story. And I've always, I've found that certain editors, sometimes you have editors that will specify in certain things, like that cut action, or, that exists like in the superhero world. They're like, this is my thing, or I cut comedies. And I'm sure when they come down, they're bringing all of their experiences with them. And so I think it's important when you start building connections and you're building a relationship with your directors and your producers, that background can come into play. There's certain moments where sometimes the script and the content don't necessarily connect. Like how something was filmed and then how it was written, you have to be that connection. You have to find a way to articulate, this is what you wrote, this is the emotion you want to evict or invoke, and this is, how you filmed it. I've got to provide that answer. Because you, as an editor, you don't really have the choice to say, this doesn't work without coming up with another option, because you look at the footage every day. That's what good editors do. They just don't say, this can't work without at least trying various options. So that's really important where your background comes in. You fill in that gap, you fill in that answer. And so say if you're doing like a sports series, if you are an athlete, you may, say like, this is an important emotion, or this is like how you can convey, how, I don't know, let's say like a moment of when an athlete gets injured, what that feels like, that devastating feeling. If you've been there, what that feels like, that jaw drop type of emotion, and you can kind of look for look for those specific niche moments and maybe what was filmed to help convey that. So
you said you were interviewed by some of the producers to get on to certain shows. When you're being interviewed, is that in your pitch? Like, are you pitching them a little bit? Like, hey, this is where my experience lies. Like, how does that, what is it like being interviewed by a producer for an assistant editor job?
Well, when I'm interviewed as an assistant editor, we're also more of a technical side when you're assistant editing. We provide the technical expertise and also kind of the, how would I describe it? You're the first line of defense for your editor. You kind of filter through everything that gets to them. And so usually when I'm interviewing, if it's on the producer, level, because I've interviewed from like just interviewing with an editor who may want to bring me on as an assistant editor, and then also like interviewing with a producer. And so a producer may want to hear about your experiences on the technical side. They want to make sure that you're able to, do X, Y, and Z when it comes to the material. You work with certain software programs, that you're able to do the paperwork, et cetera. And also you do get some creative opportunities while you're assisting with your editor. A lot of assistant editors do sound design on the TV side, and even in the feature side. You're doing a lot of the sound design. So there's that experience, which a lot of people don't realize when they watch TV. Like, we have sound mixers and sound editors who will come in later. But the first pass of sound is usually coming from the assistant editor and the editor. And usually a lot of the editors I know, they'll do music, and then they'll allow their assistant editor to do sound effects. So usually when I'm interviewed, it's on the level of, the technical side. But they also will look at, your experiences in terms of like, what's your connection with the show? What do you have in terms of your experiences in the content of that genre? So that sometimes will come into play.
Okay. And when you're being interviewed by an editor, what is that? So
an editor, it's very, like, some of my interviews with editors are very casual. Sometimes we're at a coffee shop, we might be at a park. It's very casual. And usually the editor wants to make sure that you can gel with them. We work long hours, in post-production. And so a lot of the times an editor wants to make sure that they have someone that they enjoy being around. Because if you're going to be with somebody 10 to 12 hours a day, you got to make sure you like them. And then they also want to make sure that you can pick up for the needs that they want, that you can kind of mesh with what their wants and needs are, which is not just technical, but it's also, I have editors in my circle who they care that their assistant can notice the creative points that they need versus being technical. They're like, the technical, you can always look up a YouTube video and figure out how to do something, on the technical end. But they're like, but you can't teach someone can't teach someone story, or on the fly. They really want someone who can, you're pulling sound bites that work, or you're marking takes that are better than others, outside of maybe what your script supervisor may have noted. Someone who can really be that support for the editor and everything. And also how you communicate, how do you present yourself well to others? Because you're the one kind of you may talk to more producers, more of the executives, also maybe showrunners. You're being that line of communication as well for your editor. So also how you present yourself to them and how you may communicate different issues and things. So that's kind of what an editor can look for when they're talking to you.
Okay. I just wanted to go back to the agent. Thing real quick. So it is uncommon for an assistant editor to have an agent. Like, that's rare.
I think if you have some assistant editors, we call them career assistant editors, which they're assistant editors who don't want to move up to editor. They're actually really fine just being an assistant editor, which is cool. Which is, you can make a living as an assistant editor, and you also get really good at being an assistant when you've done it for 10+ years. Yeah. And so I know some assistant editors there who they may not have an agent who works with them directly, but they may, occasionally like poke an agent or so for interest on maybe, getting help or securing a position somewhere. But a lot of, in my experiences with my colleagues, most of the agents I know are with editors, or if they do represent an assistant editor, it's an assistant editor that's trying to make a jump to editor.
Got it.
So, but most of the assistant editors I know, they don't have agents, and usually after a certain point, once you get on a certain caliber of projects, you're able to kind of navigate your way to the next, kind of the next, I guess the next project, the next gig. Your resume can kind of speak for itself, in terms of when you've got a line of shows or a line of features or whatnot on there, that kind of holds its own sometimes.
And so, what about editors? How out of 10 editors, how many have agents?
I think, well, if you would look like if you looked at a show like Black Lightning that's on a network, probably I would think maybe half to a little more than half may have agents if you work on a network show. If you're working under CW, CBS, NBC, anything like that, more than not, you're going to probably have, half the editors have agents. Usually like on our show on Black Lightning, we have 3 editors. And I know there's primarily one who has an agent. That's one of our second editors. She may have an agent. I'm not quite entirely sure. And then there's one that doesn't. So it's kind of 50-50, but I would at least say half.
Okay. That's encouraging for all the editors listening, so you don't need an agent.
No, you don't. And especially there's so many different levels now, because streaming has really, changed the game of, you can have a smaller show that does really well on a streaming platform. Yeah. I look at something like Verizon Go 90, that has like small 20-minute shows, and you can be an editor on that, and you don't have to have an agent, negotiate that. And plus, they're going to get their 10% out of it. So some people don't want to, they don't want to split their money with that. So yeah, you don't necessarily have to have to have an agent at different levels. You can pretty much find work and not have the agent, and if you're not in necessarily TV, you're more in web series. You have YouTube Red, that's really grown. You don't necessarily. There's so much like platforms and content now.
A lot of work out. So what can you tell us what a typical work week is like for you working on Black Lightning?
Yeah. So with Black Lightning, being in with the visual effects, I usually am reading the scripts of the episodes. For this past season, we had 16 episodes. So reading the scripts is extremely important, extremely to understand. There are some visual effects, post-production personnel who don't necessarily always read the scripts. But I always find that, you need context. So reading the scripts is usually like my first go-to. And then I'm usually collaborating with my this year I had a visual effects coordinator. Season 2, I had a visual effects coordinator. Season 1, I didn't have a coordinator. So my visual effects coordinator, I'll usually talk with them for any visual effects that have already been flagged. We usually, he or she, in specific, my coordinator was a he. He would already deal with the visual effects bids that we had, which is usually you'll go through We'll go through the script. They'll mark out which visual effects items are, noted or going to happen. And based off of the production schedule and how they're shooting, that's already kind of noted. And then it's usually bidded out. Specifically, we have one visual effects company we use for our show, and that's Encore Visual Effects. And so we usually have a bid that comes from them, which is based on like how many shots per scene, and how much it's going to cost. Mm-hmm. And so usually I'll coordinate with my coordinator, what's already been noted based off the script. And then once the editor comes in and he's going or she's going on their episode, because they also have their own assistant editor as well. And so their assistant editor is usually processing dailies that may come in from shooting. And so I'll usually start talking with the editor, what direction they may be going, assets that I may already have that can be used. And then I also have a visual effects artist on the show, on Black Lightning, who works with me as well. Mm-hmm. So we're usually also coordinating too about the episode. Usually now, since we were on season 2, we had a lot of stuff from season 1, that we could pull from, that we were using. And so sometimes I would pull in assets from season 1, like if there's certain graphics that we used, like for monitor comps, or, there are a lot of times they're filming. When you see TV screens in certain scenes, a lot of the TV screens are blank when it's actually filmed. Yeah. And then we go back and put in what's in the TV or the monitor. So there's assets for that I might have used, like either like QuickTime, videos of different things that can be on the monitor. Also cell phones. A lot of times when they shoot cell phones, they're blank in production. So I might start like marking different things that we can use. And then once an editor has a scene cut roughly in the way that the way they want it, they start to turn it over for visual effects. So they may mark, hey, we have Black Lightning, he's flying here. Can you add, we call it a digi-double of Black Lightning, soaring. And usually for us, we do temp visual effects that are in-house. So while the episode is going through its various versions, we have, we'll have temporary visual effects that go just to illustrate the story. Yeah. And then once those are in a good position, the editor can start their assistant editor will start exporting the episode or the cut or the scene or whatever's needed. And so my job is to track every single visual effect shot that happens in the episode. Mm. And so I make sure, I'm kind of like a middlewoman. I make sure the editor has what they need from visual effects or for the VFX that we put in. I make sure that the artist, he usually transfers his visual effects that he's created, and then I also create some too, to me, and I make sure it's cut into the episode. And then I'm also responsible for once we're like good to go and locked on the visual effects, those get sent to our visual effects company, which is Encore, and I coordinate with them. I send them all the assets for them to create the final visual effects. And then once they're done, I cut them into the episode, or if they need to be distributed for color or for sound, I do all of that as well. So I kind of follow the entire process of a visual effects shot from beginning to end. Okay. So that's usually that's a little more than a day. That's that takes time, but yeah, that's a usual day. And we did this past season, we had roughly 1,800 visual effects shots. Wow. For the season. And so I name and number them, and that number for the shot follows it through the entire life of the series. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, we'll have, a lot of the stuff that's eyes glowing, maybe eyes glowing, lightning blasts, that come out of Black Lightning's hands. We also had his daughters, for their powers. We had Jennifer, who's also lightning. She has her own style of lightning that she does, which kind of has a fiery look to it. But yeah, and then also, helping to, sometimes I get to pop in and be a creative arm on what something may look like or give ideas and everything. So it's been really cool with Black Lightning because it didn't have very much, when we started the show, they didn't have very much to go off of, except for the comic books, in terms of he never really had his own show. before. So we established a lot of rules for him in the TV world, for what he can do, his kind of own universe that he works in. So that was pretty cool. So what else? Oh, I also work with what we call invisible effects. It has a couple different names, but they're basically visual effects that you may not even realize you're watching as an audience because we're doing a lot of removing or covering up. So for example, like a lot of our stunt doubles, we remove their wires in visual effects. So, if they're flying off a building or jumping, remove all of that. We do what's called rig removal, which if they're standing on a platform and it's supposed to look like they're floating in the sky, we paint that out, we remove it. We've gone so far as we've actually added tears to one of the actor's eyes because he wasn't crying. Wow. So like a lot of people don't even realize that. A lot of times we're removing equipment or reflections in some of those effects. Like maybe like you have like the crew, the camera crew, you may see their reflections in cars and things. So we have to paint that out, remove it. We'll remove McDonald's logos, Nike logos, things that are not supposed to be there or we don't have the ability to keep there. Sometimes we don't get clearance, there's a mural, behind, in the bar wall that we didn't get cleared to use. So then it becomes a visual effect to paint that out. So a lot of different stuff people won't realize is a visual effect, but it's been pretty cool to kind of get that experience with the show.
Okay, that sounds dope. Kind of ruined my experience watching this show now. I really thought they were floating through air. So what aspect of editing do you spend the most time on when you're working on Black Lightning?
I guess a large part of it is the temp visual effects, because those will go through quite a process. Because we'll have, there's about roughly like 5 different cuts that go out of an episode, that or go through the stages of an episode. You have the editor's cut, director's cut, producer's cut, studio cut, lock cut. And so all these various versions of the cut will have different visual effects as we receive notes on various cuts. So that portion sticks with you for a while. And then what kind of makes makes my job, like, being, I guess, proficient in my job is being able to juggle those various stages with 6 or 7 episodes at a time.
Wow.
So, because you got 3 editors, so 3, they're working on 3 episodes going at a time. And then as certain episodes are entering a different stage, they may have just finished filming another episode and it's been, it gets sent right to us. So it takes about roughly 8 days, maybe a little more, a little less, to film an episode. And then it comes over to post-production.
And how long does it take for you to edit it, like to complete 100%?
Completed episode, like the entire process of an episode, probably takes somewhere between a month to some change. Probably like a little more than a month, almost 2 months to finish an episode. To go through the whole process, to go through getting completely edited, getting all its visual effects, being sent to color, getting sent for sound mixing, and then being all the paperwork that goes along with that, and then it being uploaded and sent to all our various platforms, which for us, our shows also go to Netflix. And so they have specific specs for their delivery and everything. So kind of being, I guess, on top of all those like phases, it's roughly about 2 months. Sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, in terms of what, each episode has its own kind of nature, with what it goes through to get there. Sometimes certain episodes, they require a lot of pickups, or some episodes, what's required to be in them is based on an earlier episode that may not be finished. So sometimes you're kind of playing like a cat and mouse a little bit with what's needed. That kind of happened with towards the end of the season for season 2, where we kind of had a 2-part finale. So certain parts, technically the finale couldn't be finished in a certain space until the episode before was finished, and they were working like simultaneously. They were being cut at the same time. And so it was just, it was kind of really interesting space. So sometimes certain episodes, they require more work, a little bit more like elbow grease.
So you were an assistant editor on Crashing. What is the difference in the workflow for a comedy show like Crashing and Black Lightning?
Well, for big difference is there's not, of course, as many visual effects. Just because Black Lightning is a superhero show and it falls under, the DC Entertainment whole Warner Brothers umbrella. So there's not as much in terms of, the visual effects that, were worked on. So we didn't necessarily have like a team or an assistant editor devoted to that, devoted to visual effects. So we were, both teams are small. Crashing was smaller. We only had 2 editors. There were less episodes, there were about 8 episodes. And so that's one big thing. In terms of the comedy style, which was actually really fun to work on with Crashing, with that series, because it involves a lot of comedians. You have Pete Holmes, who's really driving the series, but he brings on all his comedian friends throughout the series. And so a lot of times working with, very well-seasoned and very much, within the industry comedians, they were allowed to ad-lib a lot on this show. So a lot of times I was watching a lot to see like where they got to the joke, or they would go off script all the time and stuff. So a large part of that was kind of, tapping into, what the needs of the show are, what the style of the show is, and also what's the uniqueness of the episode that can be applied with the editor in regards to the script. So a lot of times I'm looking, I'm marking things that are jokes that I found funny or moments or takes that I thought was like, this was the funniest take. I thought this was hilarious. So that was kind of cool to work and to be in the HBO family. I think a lot of, there's a couple like signature, series that, within the comedy style that, they switched throughout the decades. And I think Crashing has started to become one of their signature comedy series, along with, like Insecure has become one. And they really kind of, mastered the smaller episodes, 8 episodes, or some shows they're, limited series, 6 or 3 episodes. They really kind of gotten that formula. And so I thought working with them, the workflow was a little different. But it was very because it's, with HBO, it's not necessarily like primetime network TV. So it kind of has sometimes a relaxed nature to it because they create the schedule the way they want to. It's not based off of, I guess, seasons in the sense of like, this is our spring show or fall show all the time. They have some flexibility, some wiggle room that sometimes primetime networks don't always have or use. So it gives off like kind of a very relaxed nature, and it was just such a smaller team, so that made it really fun to work with.
Okay. And in regards to the ad-libbing, improvising, is it frustrating? Is it frustrating for editors to edit that or to piece the story together when there's a lot of ad-libbing, improvising?
I wouldn't say it's frustrating. It's just a little more work. I think because for me, especially coming on in season 2, where there already was, the season 1 kind of established, some of the editors, they knew the nature of the show. And so they were kind of ready for it. And then me coming on a season 2, I was like, this is my first time, interacting with the show. And so it was a little new for me sometimes with kind of how far they would ad-lib. It wasn't horrible, just kind of added more time into your day or, more task at hand. But because it's not an hour-long program, it's more of a half-hour comedy that kind of made getting to the point a little easier because you don't have to necessarily fill time and stuff. But I guess with my editor, he was used to it. He came also from working on Silicon Valley. And so he was kind of used to already kind of the model, with certain HBO series. And I wouldn't say it was frustrating or hard. Just added a little bit more. You just had to work a little harder. And each actor was different. that would come on, and each comedian, how they did certain things or how they ran the joke. So for me, I had done a little bit of comedy editing but it was primarily like in grad school. It wasn't for my professional work. Or I guess you could say my grad school work was in a way professional work, for what we submitted it for in festivals and stuff. But working with HBO was my first time, working on a comedy series. So it was, I had nothing to compare it to. So it was still like, whether it took longer, it was still a good experience.
Okay. So do you seem, I'm sure you're incredibly passionate. You seem incredibly passionate about editing, assistant editing. Do you find any parts of it to be frustrating or tedious?
Yeah, it's definitely at the assistant editing level. There is definitely tediousness to a lot of the things we do because we're working on the technical side. We're doing all the the technical issues so that our editors don't have to deal with them. So why certain media is playing weird or audio or for me, like I guess on the visual effects side with tracking shots, sometimes that's a tedious task. An episode may have like 100, maybe 110 visual effects shots, and making sure I keep up with whether that shot stays in through the entire length of the show. Sometimes we may get notes at a certain stage that may end up removing a shot. And sometimes I have to like really stay on, when that happens. If an editor changes something in his cut, I have to make sure I'm aware of it because that affects it on my end. Like, if a shot's been removed, it's no longer a visual effects shot. It's no longer something we have to pay for to get done. You never want to when you start messing around with money and you end up having the production spend more money than necessary, that's a huge no. So sometimes there's tediousness in trying to keep up with that and keep up with every stage. There's also a lot of there's a lot of paperwork that kind of goes along with, especially on our show. There's a lot of, we have paperwork for every cut that goes out. It gets sent, not only uploaded to the various programs that we use to distribute to producers to watch or to directors to watch. There's also it gets archived and stored. And so there's all types of paperwork that goes with it. We have what's called, an example is continuity sheets. And so continuity sheets are basically like a breakdown of the episode, and it's how long each scene is in each part of the episode. So if you have scene 5, is Jefferson gets into an argument with his wife. And you may put that particular scene took 2 minutes, in terms of maybe you want to do an in and out, of how long that was. And by in and out, I mean when it starts and when it ends. We have to keep track of that. And so continuity sheets go out after every cut. And then we also put what music soundtrack is used for it. All types of information can go in there. So that can be kind of tedious because usually those happen either at night or on Fridays. So after the editor's done, that's when an AE is going in and they're exporting their cut. And there may be specifications that the AE needs to meet when a cut goes out. Of course, it's got to have a slate. It's got to have a time code. It's got to have different markers, or we'll call it banners sometimes, or tickers that go at the bottom of a shot that say this is temporary, or, we're missing a line here, or this is ADR, so there's a lot that goes, into making sure everyone understands what's going on in the episode when it's pretty rough. And so that can be tedious. It's frustrating when you have software issues. That's always frustrating. Because we primarily cut on Avid for the show, and then for visual effects, we also use After Effects as well to do some of our temp visual effects. And so sometimes you have times when Avid is not working correctly. It's not functioning. Yeah. Maybe taking too long to do something. Usually you're able to troubleshoot it, especially having been on the show now for as long as we've had it. We're using a lot of the same vendors for our equipment. and various things. So now it's easier to fix some problems because you run into them before, and everything. But yeah, so I mean, I would definitely say there's a tediousness to it. I wouldn't say like it's smooth sailing, for most of the workday.
Okay. So you mentioned y'all edit on Avid. Is that the standard for studio productions in 2018, 2019?
Yeah, there are a lot of studios that still use Avid, or Avid. Yeah, I would say it's a benchmark, definitely. When I came out here, I made sure that I knew Avid, and a lot of the productions, like when I was working on Animal Planet, with Puppy Bowl, that was Avid. I made sure that a lot of my thesis film that I did in grad school, I made sure to cut on Avid because I wanted to make sure I knew it. And I took courses in Avid. So it's definitely a program that's, heavily used. But I would also say, learning other software programs because they come into play all the time too. Like, I pretty much know a gamut of them, with Premiere, most of the Adobe Cloud. I use Photoshop and After Effects. Using Premiere, Final Cut, DaVinci Resolve. I'm learning or trying to learn Nuke Studio, which is another program that's good for visual effects. And that's more of like node-based editing system versus nonlinear editing system, which is an Avid and Premiere. And I find that, knowing as many as you can does not hurt. Because you'll switch kind of back and forth sometimes. So being well-versed in them, or sometimes you need to troubleshoot something and you can throw it into another program to try to figure it out. And I've just worked so many different places that were, require different things. Like in reality, you may use one of the, with World of Wonder Productions, they were still doing reality shows on Final Cut 7. Wow. And that's exactly. They were still pumping out Final Cut 7. Yeah. So, you had to know that. I was also using Final Cut 10 to do some of my exports when I was working on some of the Bravo Network reality shows. So it's great to know, or good to know, as many as possible. And I know it's tough because some people get overwhelmed. With how many or how much you need to know. And I always say, take a day at a time. When I'm in Avid, I make sure that I'm well-versed in my Avid. And there's enough Facebook groups and YouTube groups. Like if you need to know something, to easily look it up or search it and just kind of have the confidence in that. If there's something I don't know, it's okay because I'll find a way to know it.
What's a Facebook group? One Facebook group you can throw out there for people to look up?
Well, you can always look up, Avid has a Facebook group. You can always ask questions on there. I've asked questions on there, or opinions for workflows. There's a lot of assistant editor groups on Facebook. There's one I need an assistant editor on Facebook. You can always throw questions out there. And the same with Premiere. Premiere has Facebook groups. They have their own forums on the Adobe website if you ever have a question. And then, being out here now for some time, I guess I'm still kind of a newbie. I've only been out here less than 3 years. But I've created a circle of assistant editors and editors that I can always call on if I have a question or confused about something. I'll text one of my friends, hey, have you done such and such with audio before? I'm looking for this effect. And they'll say, oh, it's here. Drop this on there, adjust it to such and such level. So it's been, now I guess with social media, it's easier to find that assistance,
Okay. But so a lot of shows edit on Avid. Is there one that's more prominent than the other? Is Premiere more used more than Avid, or is it just kind of is it hard to measure?
I would say a lot of I would say a lot of network shows, just because they also run kind of certain studios are of course older than others. And I find that some of the studios that have a legacy of pumping out shows, they use Avid, and more of the newer companies and new media, prefer Premiere.
Yeah.
You know, so you could be working on a YouTube Red show and they're using Premiere. But you also have like a lot of third-party vendors that a lot of their workflow is accustomed for Avid.
Why is that? Why are the older studios using Avid, the newer ones using Premiere? Like,
I think it's, you know, at the point where Avid was king, you know, like everything was based around Avid, and then you had Final Cut 7 or Final Cut Pro come around and kind of change the game and kind of be a competitor. But then they came out with Final Cut 10, which was more user-friendly for novice, you know, people in editing. And that kind of rose Avid back up. You know, so I think a lot of workflows were based around when Avid, you know, is or was king. And they haven't really changed off that. Like it's to the point where you would spend like maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars in your workflow, you know, to switch from off of Avid.
Oh, that's what it would cost them.
Yeah, you know, it's
okay.
So you find that a lot of, and you have a lot of editors too that are some of the great, you know, great editors that are working right now. They know Avid. So sometimes the production is, you know, in order to get that expertise, they'll bring on, you know, they would rather have a software that those editors are comfortable with than bringing on something new and the editor's confused and they're like, I can't do my job because, you know, I don't know, this was the software being used, or usually it's the case, they'll know the software before they come on or whatever. But, and sometimes it's a producer's choice, you know, what they want to use. But yeah, most of the shows that I've worked on, it's primarily Avid.
Okay.
And my spare time and my independent, you know, private projects, I use Premiere.
Why is that?
It's good for like shorter projects. It's less of an online workflow, I guess you could say, like reconnecting media, relinking media. It's just easier in Premiere. Versus Avid creates its own file for media when you import it into the software, and we're using it around. So you have to really be aware of Avid's folder structure. Versus Premiere, you know, it's pretty much just, you know, linking to wherever you put a file or wherever you put a piece of media. So it's a little easier. You can move faster. And it works for smaller projects, you know, when doing that. And it's a pretty good, like all-in-one, you know, in terms of when I'm collaborating with After Effects and Photoshop. It's really easy to kind of link in between the three. You know, and working with network TV, a lot of what we do is segmented. You know, it has its own phase and its own stage and its own personnel of people. You know, so like, for example, you know, for visual effects, we're our own department. You know, so things are exported or sent to us specifically in a way through Avid for visual effects. And likewise, like, you know, we have a sound effects team as part of our sound mixing team. You know, so I send things specifically to our sound effects artists. You know, and it's very segmented, you know, so you don't necessarily need like Avid to connect to another program, because we're going to hire a person who can do that on their own program. You know, they just need to make sure they have the assets from it and stuff. So I think Avid works, you know, in that capacity, you know, with all these other programs, you know, which is why I guess studios haven't taken it away.
Okay. So you mentioned that you are, you know, you spend time and work on your own projects. I'm just kind of flabbergasted that you have time to work on your own projects. And I'm curious to know like what you're working on and what your long-term goal is. Like, do you want to be a career assistant editor, or, you know, what is your trajectory?
So for me, my trajectory, I do not want to necessarily stay an assistant editor for all of my career. Definitely moving up as editor. And I've been an editor, you know, previously on the East Coast in that market. So just working towards being an editor in this market for major studio, you know, projects. So that's kind of the goal. But also just to create, you know, I just enjoy creating. And a lot of sometimes an independent, smaller project is something that leads to something bigger. So that's why I don't rule out, working on other projects. Right now, since Black Lightning is on a break, our seasonal break or hiatus, I'm actually working with Netflix on an internal production, basically one of their company films that is, just shown through the Netflix, I guess, corporate departments and also our shareholders. And so in a similar way, if you've seen when Apple does their various shows where they show their company films for innovate, different technology or innovation, Netflix has a similar thing that they do. So that's what I'm working on right now. Currently assistant editor, but doing a lot of creative things kind of outside that role with them. So that's been really cool. And so I'm only with them like for a short time. And then I've also been working with a filmmaker friend of mine on a documentary that's short right now, and it could get to something bigger. But it follows a young lady who's about 11 years old who competes in the California Junior Rodeo. And she's an African-American cowgirl. And we're kind of following her story. And so that's something I'm working on right now. And so that's really fun. Can't wait to kind of finish that up and my friend will show it to the world. So that's been kind of a side project I've worked on. Okay. And so, yeah, I mean, you when you're in season, like something like Black Lightning, where it is long hours, you do have to you got to put in the extra work wherever you can to kind of keep pushing towards your goal. And using a show to help meet your goals. There's a lot of mentorship that happens in editorial, between an editor and assistant editor. And so that's one way, that's kind of one benefit you have of being an assistant editor is you have that mentorship. You kind of have that guidance with an editor that will either, sometimes editors give their assistant editors scenes, so you're cutting a scene on the show. I cut a scene on Black Lightning, for kicks. It didn't necessarily make it onto the show, but it was just to keep creating and keep cutting. A lot of the visual effects I make, you all never see it because it's more internal. But it's still it adds to the creative nature of where the show went. Something that I drafted, helps, be a starting point, a launching point for what the visual effect became.
How do you get to that level of becoming a show?
I think sometimes it's tenure in addition to, if you're on a series for a significant amount of time, you can parlay your way, up to being an editor because the series well. Also, it's, your editor can also be a liaison for that as well. If they know that's something that you want to do and you really work towards it, you've proven that you can cut an episode, from start to finish. You've shown that you can connect with the showrunner, the writer, or not even the writers, producers, which is interesting because with Black Lightning, our post team, like our post-production office, or myself and my other editors, is next to our writers, which is not always the case. Sometimes the editorial team, we're in another building, we're in another location. So we kind of have an advantage because we can always go ask a writer what their intentions were. But that was like a tangent, but okay. But yeah, it's you can move up in, I guess, on the TV show side by being with a show for some time. That's one way to do it. There's a number of pathways to do it. However you may connect with the producer. Sometimes it's the creator of a show and the producer. Sometimes it's the showrunner being involved on who comes on editorial too. So it just kind of varies, but there are a number of ways to move up.
Okay. Why wouldn't someone want to become an editor? Why would someone want to stay as a career assistant editor?
I think for some of my friends who are career assistant editors, I think they enjoy the work at the assistant level. I think in order to stay at it, I think you'd have to really find that that's a niche for you. And for some people, that's their niche. They're like, I enjoy this. I like being support. I like being, or I like, leading in this capacity. And, you know, you have varying levels, varying ages, varying experiences. You know, I explain that to some of my friends and colleagues who aren't in TV. You know, and some may think an assistant position is something that's like something you have when you're out of college or something like that, or when you're younger. And I'm like, no, like to be an assistant editor, they're like, you know, you have assistant editors that are 40 plus, 50 plus, you know, in age. And, you know, you don't have necessarily have to have come out of college saying I want to be in TV to make your way through to being an assistant editor. It's really great to hear other like assistant editors or editors' stories in terms of like what their life was before this. You know, you have some assistant editors who used to work in banking, and they're like, I had always wanted to be in TV, and I wanted to, you know, be an editorial, and I had been editing on the side and passionate, and so they were able to network their way and come into being an assistant editor. And there's a lot of assistant editor jobs, sometimes more than there are editor positions on a particular project. They may bring on more assistants than they do editors, you know, and so sometimes it's a little more lucrative to stay an assistant editor for some.
Okay. Is there like tips you can offer for filmmakers and directors and screenwriters that you see because you're assistant editing or editing?
I think keep creating, keep writing. People are always going to be interested in what you're working on currently or what you've had in your past, or, you know, past catalog of things, of content. And just like, don't let anybody tell you like that story doesn't matter, or, you know, or that you can't do X, Y, and Z. You know, this is kind of 2019, you know, keep writing and keep creating, you know, your stories. And I have stuff that I did in grad school that, you know, applies to, you know, I've shown my stuff and they're like, oh, wow, this was pretty good. You know, and just it's things I may have done a couple years ago, or, you know, and I show my friends or colleagues things I'm working on now. And, you know, it's always a matter of, you know, just keep creating. You'll always have something to show. If you're a writer, you should always be writing. You know, there should never not be something you're either working on or finished or, you know, have, you know, and the same for me, like I'm always cutting, you know, finding a way to continue my growth as an editor and to continue cutting and scripted and stuff. And it doesn't have to be, you know, of course I assistant edit on Black Lightning, but for other projects, it doesn't have to be something that big, you know, in order for me to continue to create. And, you know, it's kind of, if I don't find ways to create, I get bored. You know, yeah, you know, I get bored and I'm like, you know, I can't just do the in and out day to day of just kind of the tedious part. You know, you got to be creating with it. So that's kind of my advice, you know, to any artist in their profession. You know, and just don't let somebody tell you that you can't do something. You know, I never thought I could be in like a DC Comics world. I never knew that. You know, if you told me that in college, I'd be like, what? You know, and seize the opportunities when they come. You know, sometimes, you know, people are, you know, they say, you know, when opportunity comes knocking, and I always say sometimes the opportunity isn't going to knock necessarily. You know, God brings you to the door, but it's up to you to open it. You know, and so, you know, don't knock down like what a certain opportunity can bring to you, even if it's not entirely what you envisioned. You know, there's some growth to that, and, you know, something that you can maybe learn from it. You know, and I've come like a long way since my days in news. You know, and you know, it's cool. Like now I can say that I've been in the industry 10 years, which for some people that's like a speck. You know, and for me it is kind of just I'm just now getting started. You know, into what it takes that long, you know, even if you start coming, you know, I came right out of college, you know, and now do I only feel like I'm really getting into like who I am in my artistry, you know, so that's the advice I would give to other artists.
Black Lightning is a black casted show. What is the editing room like? Is it also mostly black people?
I would say we're a little bit of a mix. So with season 1, definitely, we had a lot of Black women in editorial.
Nice.
And it was really refreshing. You know, it was definitely a show that wants to make sure that we're present. And it was really rewarding to kind of be in that environment. And, you know, having Black women in editorial, you know, I'm always for, you know, the sheroes of an editorial, you know, women in general, and then just having, you know, Black women in the room, you know, it's really great. And, you know, for the show, it films in Atlanta, you know, so it's very prevalent. You know, it's easier to get, you know, crew and, I guess crew on that side that's in a, you know, a heavily predominantly African American city. And in LA is not necessarily like in Atlanta. You know, we're still trying to make strides, you know, in editorial, and actually in front of the camera has been a little bit more progressive than what's been behind it. You know, we're still trying to push for more, to see more African Americans and Blacks in post-production, to see more African Americans or people of color in general and women in editorial. It's still like, you know, it's still perceived and at times is a very much white man's role, you know, and so I like that with Black Lightning. It helped change the narrative a bit more behind the scenes, you know, for us to have, you know, that many African American women in editorial. Nice. And then in season 2, we still have a mix. It's not as many women because, you know, people change projects, you know, from season to season. So we've had new people come on and we've had some who've moved on to other projects. So the makeup is a little different, but we still have, you know, there's still, you know, African American, like myself and a couple of my colleagues that are in editorial at Black Light. And then myself, you know, I'm the only, you know, Black woman in visual effects over there internally. I'll say that because we do use a number of visual effects artists, you know, for the show, and they range from being in Atlanta to being in Los Angeles as well. So internally, though, I'm the only, you know, only woman, you know, only Black woman visual effects.
Thank you so much, Anedra, for joining us in the Black Film Space podcast. But yeah, where can our community find you on social media?
You can find me if you want to look up my credits. You can always go to the Internet Movie Database.com or IMDb.com. I'm on there. You can also do LinkedIn. I do Facebook, and I'm on Facebook and Instagram, but I mostly have like personal pages, so I don't always post my work. But if you hit me up on LinkedIn or you know, usually Facebook, if we're probably, you know, if you're in different editing spaces or anything like that, you can usually probably find me on there too, and just say like, oh, I heard you on this podcast or something, give reference, you know. But I'm always open on Facebook. You know, if you just kind of give me a little hint where you may have heard of me. But always like IMDb, LinkedIn, and yeah.
Thank you so much, Anedra. Appreciate it. Thanks for listening to the Black Film Space podcast. If you're interested in being part of our community and attending events, please visit us at blackfilmspace.com and follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Black Film Space. Subscribe to our email list and podcast. All right, thanks. See you soon.